They didn't carry bows into battle like heroes. They carried them like tools, worn, heavy, and absolutely necessary for survival. When most people imagine an archer in the ancient world, they picture something romantic. A lone figure on a hillside, wind in his hair, loosing an arrow with precision and glory. But that image has almost nothing to do with the man who actually carried a bow in the 1st century, in the land of Judea and the surrounding territories. The reality was harder, quieter, and far more brutal than any painting suggests. Who were these men? Where did they come from? What did their hands look like after 20 years of service? And what did it cost a human body and a human soul to spend a life pulling a bowstring in service of an empire or a desperate local militia? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. When Jesus walked through Galilee, when he spoke of soldiers and centurions and men under authority, he was walking among a world where violence was not distant. It was embedded in the landscape, in the roads, in the garrisons stationed at the edge of every major town. The archer was part of that world. And understanding his life cracks open an entire layer of the New Testament that most readers have never touched. If this kind of deep historical journey speaks to you, the kind that makes the Bible feel alive and grounded, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. These stories deserve to be told slowly, fully, and without shortcuts. Now, let's begin where every real story begins. Not with glory, but with the ground. In the time of Jesus, the professional archer did not emerge from military academies or structured training institutions the way modern soldiers do. He emerged almost always from poverty. In the Roman world and in the client kingdoms surrounding Judea, including the territories governed by the Herodian dynasty, archers were frequently recruited from the fringes of empire. Many came from regions like Syria, Nabatea, and the eastern provinces, where archery was already a cultural tradition embedded in hunting and herding life. A boy who had spent years in the hills watching flocks learned early that a sling or a bow was not a weapon of war. It was a tool of daily necessity. You used it against wolves, against predators, against men who came in the night to take what little your family had. By the time such a boy reached his mid-teens, he had already developed the foundational musculature that archery demands: an overdeveloped left forearm, a right shoulder sitting slightly lower than the left from years of asymmetric tension, and calluses on the fingertips so thick they no longer felt temperature properly. He did not sign a contract with fanfare. He was often conscripted, or he volunteered out of desperation. A drought year, a dead father, a debt that could not be paid any other way. The bow was handed to him not as an honor, but as a transaction. You will draw this, you will march, you will eat, and you will not complain. And so his life began, not with a battle cry, but with blisters. The training was not what you would expect. There were no formal ranges. No measured distances painted on the ground, no coaches with clipboards tracking performance. What passed for training in the auxiliary units of the Roman military and in the irregular forces of local rulers like Herod Antipas was something closer to relentless repetition under physical duress. You drew the bow until your shoulder screamed, then you drew it again. You were corrected not with instruction, but with punishment. A missed target meant fewer rations. A slow draw meant a blow across the back from a supervising officer who had no patience and no interest in your discomfort. The bow itself was not a simple piece of carved wood. The composite bow, which was standard equipment for most auxiliary archers in this period, was a sophisticated and fragile instrument. It was constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, laminated together under enormous tension. In the dry heat of the Judean lowlands or the damp cold of a Syrian winter, this weapon behaved differently. The sinew layers would absorb moisture and lose their snap. The horn could crack under sudden temperature changes. An archer who did not maintain his bow with almost daily attention, rubbing it with animal fat, keeping it wrapped in oiled leather during rain, unstringing it during long marches to preserve the tension, would find himself in battle with a weapon that was effectively useless. This was not a minor inconvenience. A bow that failed in combat meant death, not eventually, immediately. So the archer developed a relationship with his weapon that was closer to the relationship a carpenter had with his tools or a farmer had with his plow. It was the object that stood between him and oblivion. He slept with it close. He inspected it every morning the way another man might check his sandals before a long walk, methodically, quietly, without drama. Because there was no drama in survival. Survival was just the next thing you did. His quiver typically held between 20 and 30 arrows. Each arrow was also a carefully constructed object, a wooden shaft that had to be straight to within very precise tolerances, tipped with an iron or bronze point, and fletched with feathers, usually from geese or vultures, that had to be attached at an exact angle to create the spin that gave the arrow its accuracy. A poorly fletched arrow didn't just miss its target. It could veer sideways at full draw and injure the man standing next to you. The archers in a Roman auxiliary unit marched alongside infantry. They were not cavalry. They were not protected by the heavy rectangular shields, the scutum, that the legionary infantry carried. Their protection was light, a small round shield, leather or scale armor at best, and the assumption that they would be positioned far enough behind the front line to avoid direct contact. That assumption was frequently wrong. In the hills of Galilee, in the rocky passes of Idumea, in the narrow streets of rebellious towns, distance collapsed instantly. The archer who had trained to loose arrows at targets 40 or 50 meters away suddenly found himself in close quarters chaos. His bow nearly useless at arm's length, his only remaining option a short blade he had barely been trained to use. This is the world Jesus walked through. The garrison towns, the checkpoints, the soldiers with their asymmetric shoulders and their worn leather quivers, and their eyes that had learned to stay flat and unrevealing, because showing what you felt was a luxury that men in their position could not afford. The body of an archer aged differently from other men. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, physical reality that archaeologists and forensic anthropologists have documented in skeletal remains from this period across the Near East and Mediterranean world. The bones told the story that the man himself would never have spoken aloud. The left arm, the bow arm, the arm that held the weapon extended and rigid against the enormous force of a drawn composite bow, developed a condition that researchers now recognize in ancient skeletons, a pronounced thickening of the cortical bone along the radius and ulna, the two bones of the forearm. The repeated stress of holding a bow at full draw, sometimes hundreds of times a day during training, caused the bone itself to remodel, to grow denser and heavier as the body attempted to reinforce what was being constantly strained. In living terms, this meant chronic aching. In cold weather, the forearm throbbed. In damp seasons, the joints at the wrist swelled slightly and made fine movement difficult. The right shoulder told a different story. The rotator cuff, the complex of tendons and muscles that allows the arm to rotate and draw back, was under extraordinary tension every single time the archer pulled the bowstring to his jaw or his ear. Over years, this tissue broke down. Partial tears accumulated. The shoulder began to sit lower than its counterpart, pulled forward and down by chronic inflammation and scar tissue. Many archers by their 30s moved their right arm with a particular careful economy, a subtle guardedness, as though the shoulder was something that needed to be protected from sudden movement. They were, by any reasonable measure, men in constant low-grade pain. And they marched anyway, and they drew anyway, because stopping was not a category that existed in their world. Now consider what Jesus observed when he looked at the soldiers stationed throughout his land. He was not looking at powerful, invulnerable figures. He was looking at damaged men, men who had entered military service young, often without meaningful choice, and who were now carrying the accumulated cost of that service in their bones and their joints and their faces. When a Roman centurion approached Jesus in Capernaum, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew in the 8th chapter, and spoke with remarkable humility and faith, Jesus did not see a symbol of imperial oppression in isolation. He saw a man embedded in a system of authority and violence, yes, but also a man who understood command and suffering and the weight of responsibility in a way that most religious leaders of the time had never experienced firsthand. Jesus said he had not found such faith in all of Israel. That statement lands differently when you understand the world this officer inhabited. A world where faith in anything invisible was a dangerous luxury, where what you trusted was the weapon in your hand and the man standing next to you, and where the distance between life and death was measured in the straightness of an arrow shaft. The archers who served in Judea and Galilee during this period were not exclusively Roman citizens. The vast majority were auxiliaries, non-citizens recruited from conquered or allied peoples. They served for 25 years in exchange for Roman citizenship upon discharge, if they survived. 25 years. A man who enlisted at 16 would receive his citizenship documents at 41. If his shoulder had not completely failed, if infection had not taken him after a minor wound, if dysentery had not killed him in a winter camp somewhere in the Syrian interior. Many did not collect. The discharge records that survive from Roman Egypt, papyrus documents listing auxiliary veterans, show us names and units and dates. They do not show us what those men looked like when they finally stopped marching, but the skeletons do. There is a moment in the Gospel of Luke that most readers pass through without stopping. Jesus is walking toward Jerusalem. He passes through a region between Samaria and Galilee, border territory, contested ground, the kind of landscape that military units patrolled precisely because it was unstable and difficult to control. It is in this region, on this kind of road, that he encounters 10 men with leprosy standing at a distance, calling out to him. The detail that tends to receive attention is the healing. The detail that tends to be overlooked is the road itself. Roads in first-century Judea and Galilee were not neutral spaces. They were corridors of power and vulnerability simultaneously. The Roman road system that connected garrison towns and administrative centers was engineered with military logic, straight where possible, elevated where practical, designed to move troops and supply lines efficiently. Along these roads at intervals, there were stationed units of soldiers whose function was enforcement, tax collection points, checkpoint inspections. The visible presence of imperial authority, made concrete in leather and iron, and the occasional drawn bow. An archer stationed at a road checkpoint in Galilee was not there for ceremony. He was there because the road was dangerous, and because the empire's tolerance for disruption was extremely low. Banditry was endemic in the hill country. Resistance movements operated in the shadows of the same landscape where shepherds grazed their flocks. The line between a traveling merchant and a courier for a rebel faction was not always clear, and the archer's job was to stand at that ambiguity and make rapid decisions with incomplete information. This is the texture of the world Jesus moved through every single day. Not a peaceful pastoral landscape of gentle hills and wildflowers, though those things existed too, but a landscape threaded with tension, watched by men whose bodies were instruments of state violence and whose minds had been trained to categorize every approaching figure as either threat or non-threat within seconds. When Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, he placed it on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. That road was specifically known in the ancient world for its danger. It descended roughly 1,000 meters over a distance of about 27 kilometers, winding through limestone wilderness where ambushes were not hypothetical. The man in the parable who was beaten and left for dead was not a literary device. He was a recognizable type. His audience had seen men like him, or had been men like him, or had passed men like him on that road without stopping, exactly as the priest and the Levite in the story did, because stopping on a dangerous road to help a stranger was itself a risk that not everyone could afford to take. The archer understood this calculus better than almost anyone. He had spent years living inside it. Every figure that approached his post was assessed. Every bundle of cloth that might conceal a weapon was noted. The cost of being wrong was paid in blood, and the blood was often his own. And yet Jesus walked those roads, slowly, stopping, touching people that others would not touch, speaking to people that the social architecture of his world had placed permanently beyond the boundary of acceptable contact. He did this not in ignorance of the danger, but in full awareness of it. The cross was not a surprise to him. It was the destination that his manner of moving through the world made inevitable. The archer, the soldier, the auxiliary conscript who had given his 20s and his 30s and his shoulder to an empire that would discard him at 40. He was not outside the reach of what Jesus was doing. He was precisely the kind of man Jesus kept stopping for. Damaged. Functional. Carrying weight that had never been acknowledged as weight. Understanding the brutality of a soldier's life in this period does not diminish the gospel, it deepens it. It makes the gentleness of Jesus not a given, not a default mode of a peaceful era, but a deliberate, costly, countercultural act performed inside a world that ran on coercion and pain. That is the ground the Gospels were written on. Not abstraction, not theology in the air, theology in the body, in the thickened forearm bone, in the shoulder that ached every morning, in the man who stood at the checkpoint and watched Jesus pass and perhaps did not know what he was seeing, but felt for a moment something he had no word for.